A retired millionaire businessman carried the devastating pain of losing his wife just a few months earlier. On one of his Sunday visits to her grave, he became furious at first when he saw a homeless girl sleeping on the sacred tombstone of his beloved. As he marched with determination to expel her from the cemetery, something made him stop in his tracks. The child held tightly against her chest a photograph identical to the one he kept of his young wife, an image that only someone very special could possess. When the girl woke up frightened and tried to run away, he gently called her back, but she disappeared among the trees before he could ask a single question. What did that mysterious child know about his wife that he himself didn't? And how did she get such an intimate picture of his one true love? What happens next is chilling. The Sunday air hung heavy over Willow Creek Memorial Park, thick and humid, laden with the sweet, sad perfume of lilies and damp earth. For Arthur, it was the scent of grief itself, an aroma that had become the soundtrack to his weekends. At 55, he was a man carved from discipline and success. His upright posture, the impeccably tailored suit, and a gaze that seemed to calculate the value of everything around him were the armor he had worn for decades. It was an armor that had helped him build a colossal fortune, a business empire that spanned continents, turning his initial capital into a net worth that landed him on the Forbes list. But here, before the wrought iron gates, he wasn't the magnate, the Wall Street shark everyone feared and respected. He was just a man, stripped of his titles, dragging the weight of a broken heart. Each step along the stone path was a ritual. He passed the same headstones, recognizing the names etched into the cold marble, but his eyes were fixed on a single point on the grey horizon, Helena's mausoleum. It was there, on that hallowed piece of ground, that he tried to find the fragments of himself that had been lost the day she was gone. He always brought a bouquet of white roses, her favorite, and would spend hours in silence, speaking to his wife's memory. On this day, however, the peace he sought was shattered by an incongruous sight. A splash of color, small and huddled, rested against the pristine white marble of Helena's tomb. Irritation shot up his spine like an electric shock. Who would dare desecrate this place? His mind, trained to identify and eliminate problems, classified the scene as an invasion, an unacceptable disruption. With firm steps and his face set in a mask of contained fury, he approached. It was a girl, a child, perhaps no more than 8 or 9 years old, dressed in worn, dirty clothes. She was fast asleep, using the base of the headstone as a pillow, oblivious to the storm brewing inside the man watching her. Arthur's anger boiled over. He opened his mouth to drive her away, to shout that this was a place of respect, not a shelter for strays. The harsh words, the same ones he used to close multi-million-dollar deals, were on the tip of his tongue. But then, his gaze fell on the object the girl clutched to her chest, protected by her thin arms, as if it were the most precious thing in the world. The air left his lungs. Time stopped. It was a photograph, a small photo in a tarnished silver frame. In it, a young Helena was smiling, the sun of their honeymoon in Capri illuminating her face, the same smile that had made Arthur believe happiness was a tangible thing. It was an exact copy of the photo he kept on his own nightstand, the image he kissed every night before surrendering to a dreamless sleep. The fury dissolved, replaced by a tidal wave of confusion. How? Where did this girl, a complete stranger, get that photo? The sound of a dry leaf cracking under his shoe startled the child awake. Her eyes flew open wide and frightened, and for a fleeting moment, Arthur saw a familiar spark in them, a glimmer of Helena's gaze. The girl scrambled to her feet, panic etched on her face. She turned and ran, vanishing between the tombstones like a ghost. Arthur stood paralyzed, his hand outstretched in the air, the bouquet of roses forgotten at his side. He was alone again, but the silence of the cemetery now screamed an impossible question. The silence that followed the girl's flight was more deafening than any shout. Arthur remained motionless, his arms still extended into the void like a statue of regret. The white roses lay on the damp grass, a forgotten offering. His mind, a precise mechanism trained to analyze stock markets and predict business trends, simply shut down. There was no logic, no data to process. There was only an image seared into his memory, the photo of Helena in the arms of an unknown child. Who was she? How had that relic, such an intimate piece of his history, ended up in the hands of a street urchin? The question echoed in his head, devoid of an answer, leaving him with a sense of vertigo. He, who controlled a vast fortune and made decisions that moved millions, felt completely powerless. Slowly, he lowered his arm. His eyes scanned the cemetery, desperately searching for a glimpse of the girl. But she had dissolved among the headstones and the shadows of the trees. A part of him, the ruthless businessman, wanted to deploy his team, to use his money and influence to find her. But another part, a facet of himself he barely recognized, felt paralyzed by the magnitude of the mystery. This was personal, something money didn't seem equipped to solve. He bent down, picked up the bouquet, and placed it carefully on the tomb. "Helena," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "What is this? What are you trying to tell me?" The cold marble, as always, remained silent. The walk back to the car was the longest of his life. Each step felt like it weighed a ton. Albert, his driver and loyal companion for over 20 years, watched in the rearview mirror as Arthur approached. He saw the turmoil on his boss's face, an expression he hadn't seen since the day Helena had passed. He opened the door without a word, a gesture of respect and understanding. During the ride back to the stately mansion, the silence inside the car was thick. Outside, the city pulsed with life. But to Arthur, it all seemed distant, muffled. He thought of Helena. She would have seen the girl not as an intruder, but as a soul in need. She would have knelt, offered a warm smile and a hug, without caring about the dirty clothes or tangled hair. The memory of her kindness was like a knife in his chest, sharpening the edges of his own initial reaction. Upon arriving home, the grandeur of the mansion suffocated him. The empty halls, filled with priceless art and expensive furniture, seemed to mock his loneliness. What was the point of all this wealth if the heart of his home had stopped beating? That night, sleep wouldn't come. Arthur wandered the house, the image of the girl and the photograph haunting his thoughts. The initial confusion gave way to a cold determination. This wasn't random. There was a connection, a story he didn't know, and he had to uncover the truth. It was like a high-risk investment, but the potential return was his own peace of mind. In the morning, he cancelled all his meetings. He ignored the calls from his fund managers and advisors. There was only one priority: returning to the cemetery. The morning sun cast a different light on the place, but Arthur's unease remained. Helena's tomb was as he'd left it, the white roses beginning to wilt. There was no sign of the girl. Frustration began to build, but then he noticed something. A short distance away, a man in grey overalls was tending to a flower bed. It was the groundskeeper, a constant, almost invisible figure he saw every Sunday. He'd always been there, in the background. Maybe he'd seen something. Maybe he knew something. A new hope, fragile but insistent, bloomed in his chest. He had to talk to that man. Arthur approached the groundskeeper with the same caution he would use when approaching a competitor in a delicate negotiation. The man, his back bent by time and labor, didn't seem to notice his presence. He was trimming the edges of a bed of chrysanthemums with gardening shears, his movements slow and methodical. Arthur cleared his throat, a sound strangely timid, coming from a man accustomed to commanding boardrooms. The groundskeeper turned, his watery blue eyes looking Arthur up and down without surprise. There was a serenity in his wrinkled face that contrasted with Arthur's inner storm. "Can I help you, sir?" the man asked, his voice low and calm like the earth he tended. I was here yesterday, Arthur began, the words stumbling. There was a girl, a child, sleeping right there. He pointed to Helena's tomb. Did you see her? The groundskeeper wiped his dirt-caked hands on his overalls and nodded slowly. Ah, yes, little Marina. She's a regular. The name hit him like a punch. Marina. The girl had a name. She wasn't just an anonymous figure, an anomaly in his routine of grief. She was Marina. A regular, Arthur repeated, trying to keep his voice steady, to hide the tremor of anxiety running through him. What do you mean, a regular? Ever since Mrs. Helena passed, the man replied, his gaze shifting to the white marble headstone. Almost every day, sometimes she just sits there, quiet-like. Other times, she talks to the stone, like she's telling it about her day, and sometimes, when she's real tired, she'll take a nap there. She doesn't harm anyone. The casual way the groundskeeper spoke of it completely disarmed Arthur. To this man, Marina's presence was part of the landscape, a small ritual of mourning as valid as the flowers Arthur brought. Do you know where she lives? Arthur asked, urgency coloring his voice. The groundskeeper studied him for a moment, a flicker of suspicion in his eyes. Why do you want to know? You're not going to cause trouble for her, are you? Life's been hard enough on that little one. The man's defensiveness made Arthur pull back. He realized how cold, how interrogative his approach sounded. He had to change tactics. He remembered Helena, how she could win anyone's trust with a simple gesture of empathy. He took a deep breath, trying to channel some of her softness. No, not at all, he said, his voice lower. I'm just worried and confused. She had something, a photograph of my wife. The mention of the photograph seemed to soften the groundskeeper's expression. I don't know much, he admitted. I know she doesn't have family around, and that Mrs. Helena was important to her. Very important. He paused, as if weighing whether to continue. Sometimes, people just need a place to feel like they belong, even if it's a place of silence. Arthur felt a lump in his throat. He, with all his money, with his mansion and his assets, had a place to return to but felt like a stranger in his own life. This girl, with nothing, sought belonging at a tomb. The irony was cruel. He took his wallet from his pocket, an almost instinctive gesture. I want to find her. I need to understand. Please, if you know anything, I can compensate you. He pulled out several large bills, a habit for a man who believed every problem had a price. The groundskeeper looked at the money in his hand, then at his eyes, and a sad smile touched his lips. Keep your money, sir. Some things don't have a price. He leaned in and whispered, as if sharing a secret. She doesn't go far. Check the old abandoned mill, near the back entrance of the cemetery. That's where she shelters from the rain. With that, he turned and went back to his chrysanthemums, leaving Arthur alone with the information that could change everything. Arthur thanked the groundskeeper, his voice barely a whisper, and walked away with hurried steps. The information was a hot coal in his mind, igniting a fire of urgency he hadn't felt in years. An abandoned building. The image was desolate. He, who lived surrounded by luxury, whose investments in high-end real estate generated astronomical profits, could barely conceive of a child living in ruins. The chasm between their worlds made him feel a pang of shame. He walked along the cemetery wall, following the groundskeeper's directions toward the back. The area was more neglected, with overgrown weeds and ancient, forgotten headstones. A few yards from the service gate, rusted and secured with a thick chain, he saw it. It was the skeleton of an old factory, perhaps a textile mill, its brick walls stained with soot and time. The windows were empty sockets, like blind eyes staring into nothing. The roof had collapsed in several places, creating a maze of twisted beams and rubble. The place reeked of dereliction and despair. For a moment, Arthur hesitated. What did he expect to find here? What would he say to the girl if he found her? Words failed him. He was not a man of gentle gestures or delicate conversations. His world was one of numbers, contracts, and market strategies. Dealing with the vulnerability of a child was an unknown and terrifying territory. But the image of Helena, smiling in the photograph, pushed him forward. He owed it to her. He owed it to himself. He found a gap in the chain-link fence and squeezed through, feeling the expensive fabric of his suit snag on the wire. Inside, the silence was broken only by the drip of water somewhere and the sound of his expensive shoes crunching on broken glass. The smell of mold and dust was overpowering. He called her name, first softly, almost a whisper. "Marina." No answer. He tried again, louder. "Marina, are you there? I'm not going to hurt you. I just want to talk." The echo of his voice was lost in the vastness of the warehouse. He began to walk through the space, dodging puddles and piles of debris. The place was a labyrinth of shadows and light, filtering through gaps in the roof. In a corner, more sheltered from the rain, he saw it. A small nest, a tattered old mattress, covered with a threadbare blanket and a few clothes folded with touching care. Beside it, a cardboard box held a few items: a worn children's book, a one-eyed rag doll, and a small jar with a few coins. It was her sanctuary, her entire estate. And there, on top of the blanket, was the silver frame, the photo of Helena. He approached slowly, his heart pounding erratically. He picked up the photograph with trembling hands. The glass was cracked, but his wife's smile still shone through. Tucked behind the photo, held by a piece of tape, was a small, yellowed envelope. His fingers, accustomed to signing checks for amounts that could change the fate of companies, fumbled as he tried to open it. It was then that a noise startled him, the sound of hurried footsteps on the rubble. He turned just in time to see a small figure standing in the gloom, her eyes wide with fear. It was her, Marina. She stared at him, her body tense, ready to run at any moment. Their eyes met, and the world seemed to stop. The billionaire and the homeless child, united by the ghost of a woman they both loved, were finally face to face. The silence in the abandoned warehouse was heavy, fraught with fear and distrust. Marina watched him with the wariness of a cornered animal, her large, dark eyes darting from him to the photograph in his hand. Arthur could feel her heart racing, even from a distance. He knew that any sudden move, any wrong word, would make her bolt again, perhaps for good. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to relax his shoulders, to soften the hard expression that was so natural to him. He had to break through that wall of fear. But how? He, who had built his fortune with the coldness of a predator, now needed to find the gentleness of a guardian. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, his voice softer than he'd expected. "My name is Arthur, and this woman in the picture, she was my wife, Helena." The girl didn't move, but her eyes widened slightly at the sound of the name. It was the first crack in the wall of her fear. Arthur decided to take a chance. He slowly knelt, ignoring the filth and broken glass that pressed into his expensive suit. The gesture brought him down to her level, lessening the threat of his height and imposing posture. He held the photograph out to her, an olive branch in the form of an image. "I just want to understand," he continued, his voice thick with an emotion that surprised him. "How did you know her? This photo, it's very important to me." Marina hesitated, her body still tense. She looked at the photo, then at his face, searching for any sign of danger. Slowly, as if approaching a flame, she took one step, then another. Her bare feet made almost no sound on the concrete floor. She stopped at a safe distance and finally spoke, her voice small and fragile, almost a whisper. "She was my mother." The words landed on Arthur with the weight of an avalanche. Mother. The word reverberated in his mind, shattering the reality he knew. Helena. A mother. How was that possible? They'd never had children. A mutual decision. He'd always thought, made in the early years of their marriage when their careers were taking off, his own drive, her dedication to her charities, it had all seemed to make sense. But this changed everything. The ground beneath his feet seemed to vanish. Your mother, he managed to say, his voice cracking. The girl nodded, her eyes filling with tears. She wasn't my real mom. She was my mother of the heart. She used to visit me at the orphanage. Every week, she brought me books, told me stories, and she gave me this picture. She said it was so I would never forget her. Orphanage. The word added another layer of shock to the revelation. Helena had been secretly visiting an orphanage. Why? Why had she never told him? The question was an open wound in his chest. She came to see you every week, he asked, trying to process the information. Yes, Marina whispered, until one day. She didn't come anymore. The lady at the orphanage said she'd gone on a trip to a place far away where she couldn't come back from. I waited, but she never came back. The innocence in her voice was devastating. To her, Helena hadn't died. She had simply disappeared. Arthur's grief, which he had considered his own exclusive burden, suddenly felt selfish. There was someone else, a child, sharing his pain in silence, in an abandoned warehouse. He felt a wave of conflicting emotions. Anger, sorrow, confusion. Anger at Helena for keeping such a monumental secret. Sorrow for the girl for her abandonment. And a profound confusion about the woman he thought he knew so well. Looking at Marina, he saw not just a stranger, but a living piece of his wife's heart. A secret of love she had kept hidden. And in that instant, he knew that his life, his past and his future had been irrevocably altered. The revelation hung in the dusty air of the warehouse, heavy and irrefutable. Arthur remained kneeling, the world spinning around him. Helena, his Helena, the woman with whom he had shared more than 30 years of his life, had a secret garden, and at its center bloomed a love for this small child. He looked at Marina, who was now sniffling softly, trying to hold back her tears, and a painful question formed in his mind, as sharp as a shard of glass. Why? He asked, his voice barely audible. Why didn't she ever bring you home? Why did she never tell me about you? Marina took a step back, fear returning to her eyes. She looked small and fragile, as if the weight of that question was too much for her shoulders. She shook her head, her tangled hair falling across her face. She said you wouldn't like it. The girl whispered, the words coming out with difficulty. She said you were a very important man, very busy with your business, that you would be angry. She paused, swallowing hard. She was afraid that I would ruin your reputation. Every word was a direct blow to Arthur's heart. Angry, reputation, business. They were the cornerstones upon which he had built his empire, the pillars of his identity. He had always prided himself on his image, the ruthless businessman, the cold negotiator, the man who didn't let emotions interfere with his decisions. He saw these traits as symbols of strength, the armor that protected him and guaranteed his success, his millions in assets. But now, through the eyes of a frightened child, he saw that same armor as a cage that had imprisoned his wife, forcing her to hide the purest, most selfless part of herself. The woman he loved had been afraid of him, afraid of his reaction, his judgment, his pride. The realization was so devastating, it left him breathless. He sank to the dirty floor, his designer suit now a meaningless rag. He was no longer the billionaire, the master of the financial universe. He was a man confronted with the greatest failure of his life, the failure to truly know the person who mattered most. All of his investments, his stock portfolio, his fortune in dollars and euros, all of it seemed like dust next to the wealth Helena had cultivated in secret, a wealth he had been unable to see. He'd spent his entire life accumulating capital, but he was emotionally bankrupt. "I wouldn't have been angry," he said, his voice hoarse, more to himself than to the girl. I would have loved you." But the truth was, he wasn't sure. The Arthur of a few months ago, consumed by work and the relentless pursuit of more profit, might have seen an orphan child as a complication, an unwanted distraction. The honesty of that thought shamed him deeply. Marina, sensing the shift in his posture, the genuine pain in his eyes, took another step forward. "After she didn't come back anymore," she continued, her voice a little steadier, "the orphanage got sad. I ran away. I couldn't stand waiting for her there anymore, at least here." She glanced around at the ruins. "I can be close to her." She pointed in the direction of the cemetery. Arthur understood. Helena's tomb wasn't a pillow for Marina. It was the last link to the only mother she had ever known. The abandoned mill wasn't a hideout. It was a waiting room. He looked at this child, so small and so resilient, who had faced abandonment and loneliness with a courage he'd never had to muster. He felt an overwhelming urge to protect her, to fix what had been broken. But how? He was a stranger to her, the man who, in her imagination, would have rejected her. Trust, he knew, was a far harder asset to acquire than any stock on the Nasdaq. Time seemed to freeze in the ruined warehouse. Arthur, the man whose fortune was built on the ability to anticipate the future, felt completely adrift in a past he never knew. He looked at Marina's tear-streaked face, a face that held the echo of Helena's smile, and he felt the weight of his own mistakes, his rigidity, his pride, his single-minded devotion to business. All of it had built a wall so high that not even his wife could climb it to show him her heart. He wasn't just a grieving widower, he was an unwitting accomplice to Helena's loneliness. The pain of that realization was sharper than any financial loss he had ever endured. Losing money was recoverable. Losing the trust of the person you loved was a bankruptcy of the soul. He stood up, brushing the dust from his trousers with an automatic, useless gesture. You must be hungry," he said, his voice sounding strange to his own ears, stripped of its usual authority. It was a simple offer, the only thing his pragmatic mind could formulate. A first step, small and uncertain, across the chasm that separated them. Marina watched him cautiously, her eyes still wet. She wasn't used to kindness, especially from a man she had been taught to fear, but there was something in his gaze, a deep and genuine sorrow, that made her believe him. She gave a timid nod, an almost imperceptible movement. A fragile moment of understanding was born between them. A silent truce in the desolation of that place. Arthur began to think about what to do next. He would take the girl to get something to eat, then he didn't know. The future was a blank page. But for the first time since Helena's death, he felt he was no longer alone in his labyrinth of pain. There was a purpose, a duty, a legacy of love that had to be honored. It was then that the sound of a car screeching to a halt outside shattered the quiet. Doors slammed shut, and adult voices, firm and authoritarian, cut through the air. "Marina, we know you're in there!" A sharp, impatient female voice yelled. "It's Mrs. Albright from the orphanage. Playtime's over. We've come to take you back." Terror instantly washed over Marina's face. The color drained from her cheeks, and her eyes widened in pure panic. She let out a small whimper and, in an instinctive move, grabbed the sleeve of Arthur's jacket, her small hand clenching with surprising force. In that moment, he ceased to be the man her mother had feared and became her only shield. The transformation inside Arthur was immediate and visceral. The paralysis of guilt gave way to a fierce, protective instinct. All his strategic skill, all his ability to think under pressure, which for years had been dedicated to amassing wealth and power, now focused on a single objective: protect this child. "Shh, stay quiet, don't make a sound," he whispered, his voice firm and controlled. He pulled her back with him, deeper into the warehouse's shadows, behind a stack of rusted machinery. The place that had felt like a trap now became their sanctuary. He wrapped an arm around her, feeling her small, trembling body against his. "I won't let them take you." The voices grew closer. "There's no use hiding, dear. You know the rules. A social worker is waiting for us." Footsteps crunched on the gravel outside, drawing nearer to the opening where Arthur had entered. A beam from a flashlight swept the darkness, dancing dangerously close to them. A shadow fell over them, blocking what little light reached them. The footsteps stopped, just on the other side of the crumbling wall where they hid. The flashlight beam danced erratically across the warehouse walls, an inquisitor's eyes searching the dark. Arthur held Marina close, his heart hammering against his ribs. He felt the uncontrollable tremor of her small body and instinctively tightened his embrace, trying to transmit a security he barely felt himself. In that instant, the complex architecture of his life, the net worth, the international deals, the reputation, collapsed into a single, simple truth. He had to protect this girl. It was a primal urge, a responsibility that stemmed directly from the love he and Helena had shared, even if he was only now discovering its depth. "You might as well come out, Marina. Don't make this any harder." Mrs. Albright's voice called, closer now, laced with an impatience that bordered on a threat. Arthur could hear the crunch of her shoes on debris as she stepped inside. He glanced down and saw Marina's eyes locked on his, filled with a silent, desperate plea. In that look, he saw not just fear, he saw the reflection of his own failure, the ghost of a promise Helena couldn't keep, a promise that was now his to honor. He had to think fast. A direct confrontation would be a mistake. They had authority, the law on their side. He was a stranger, a rich man in a suspicious place with a runaway child. The optics were terrible. His mind, honed by years of high-stakes negotiations, began to formulate a plan. Surprise was his only asset. He put a finger to his lips, signaling silence to Marina, and pointed toward a smaller opening at the back of the warehouse, a narrow passage partially blocked by a fallen beam. It was risky, but it was their only way out. While the voices and the flashlight beam focused on the main area, Arthur guided Marina through the shadows, moving with a stealth he didn't know he possessed. Every step was calculated, every noise muffled. The smell of rust and damp was suffocating. They reached the fallen beam. Arthur, using all his strength, managed to shift the heavy timber just enough to create a gap. He slid through first, then helped Marina across. Outside, the cool afternoon air felt like a blessing. They were in a narrow alley that ran along the back of the factory. "Come on," he whispered. Taking her hand, her small, cold skin in his was a vivid reminder of what was at stake. They started to run, not toward Arthur's luxury car, which would be too conspicuous, but in the opposite direction, deeper into the unfamiliar streets of the forgotten neighborhood. They ran for blocks, the sound of their footsteps and ragged breaths, the only soundtrack. Arthur hadn't run like this in decades. The physical exertion burned his lungs, but adrenaline and fear for Marina's safety propelled him forward. He was a billionaire fleeing on foot, an orphan girl in hand, and as absurd as the situation was, he had never felt so alive, so focused on a single purpose. When they finally stopped, gasping for air in a small park several blocks away, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Arthur looked at Marina. Her face was smudged with dirt, her hair a mess, but her eyes, once filled with terror, now held something new, a spark of trust. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice still trembling, but without the earlier panic. The question hit him with force. Where were they going? He couldn't take her to his mansion. It would be the first place they'd look. He needed a safe place, a haven where they could hide and he could plan his next move. The answer came to him suddenly, a memory of Helena, a small, simple place she had loved, a place no one would ever associate with him. The memory surfaced with startling clarity, a gift from Helena from beyond the grave. It was a small apartment she kept on the coast, about an hour from the city. She called it her refuge, a place she went when she needed to breathe the sea air and hear her own thoughts. Arthur had only been there a few times early on. Over the years, his business had consumed him so thoroughly that he'd seen her getaways as a harmless whim, never understanding the real need that drove her there. The apartment was in her name, a tiny, almost negligible asset in his vast portfolio, something none of his lawyers or accountants would ever flag. It was the perfect hideout. "I know a place," he told Marina, trying to project a confidence he barely felt. "It's a safe place. No one will find us there." He used his phone to call for an app-based car, choosing a name and pickup point far from their current location to avoid leaving a trail. While they waited on a deserted park bench, a new dynamic began to form between them. The shared fear and desperate escape had broken through the ice of distrust. Marina, exhausted, leaned her head against his arm, a gesture of surrender that made Arthur's heart ache. He took off his suit jacket and draped it over her. The expensive wool, which once represented status and power, now served as a blanket for a frightened child. He never imagined one of his suits could hold so much value. The ride was silent. Marina fell asleep almost immediately, her peaceful face finally free of panic. Arthur watched her, studying her features in the passing streetlights. He saw traces of Helena in her serenity, but he also saw the mark of life's hardness on her young face. He thought of his own life, a linear trajectory of ambition and acquisition. He had planned every investment, every takeover, every move on the corporate chessboard. But for what was happening now, there was no plan. He was improvising, driven by an instinct he thought he'd lost, to protect someone other than himself. They arrived at the small, oceanfront building late at night. Arthur carried the sleeping Marina in his arms. Her weight was next to nothing, but the responsibility he felt was immense. He found the spare key where Helena always left it, under a geranium pot on the balcony. As he opened the door, the scent of the place enveloped him. It was the scent of Helena, a mix of sea salt, old books, and lavender. The apartment was simple, almost Spartan compared to his mansion, but it was warm and full of life. There were seashells and smooth stones lined up on the windowsill, amateur watercolors she had painted hanging on the walls, and a stack of books on the nightstand. It was a sanctuary of his wife's soul, a side of her he barely knew. He laid Marina gently on the bed in the small guest room and covered her with a quilt. For a moment, he just stood there, watching her sleep. The girl who had slept on a tomb was now sleeping in a warm, safe bed. The image filled him with an emotion so powerful it made him dizzy. It was a mixture of relief, sorrow, and a protective love that grew with every second. He backed out of the room and went to the small living area, sinking into a wicker armchair. The full moon shone on the ocean, its waves breaking softly on the sand. In that quiet, Arthur faced the hardest truth of all. He wasn't just running from the orphanage. He was running from himself, from the man he had been. And for the first time, he wondered if he had the strength to become the man that Helena, and now Marina, needed him to be. The legal battle would be just the beginning. The real fight would be within his own heart. The next morning came with a soft light filtering through the blinds, bringing with it the calming sound of the waves. Arthur hadn't slept. He had spent the night in the armchair, lost in a whirlwind of thoughts and memories as the ocean murmured outside. He watched the sunrise, a spectacle he hadn't appreciated in years, always too busy with the morning reports from the Tokyo or London stock exchanges. Here, in Helena's refuge, time seemed to move at a different pace, a more human one. He heard a noise from the bedroom and his heart leaped. Marina was awake. He found her standing in the doorway, sleepy-eyed and with her hair even more tangled. She was wearing an old t-shirt of Helena's he'd found in a drawer, which hung on her like a nightgown. For a moment, she looked confused, glancing around the unfamiliar room. Then her eyes met Arthur's, and the fear of the previous night was replaced by a shy relief. "I'm hungry," she said, her voice small and raspy with sleep. The simplicity of her need was grounding, a problem that Arthur, for the first time in a long while, knew exactly how to solve. He, who hadn't set foot in his own kitchen in years, rummaged through the apartment's cupboards and fridge. He found eggs, bread, some milk, and a box of cereal. As he clumsily prepared breakfast, he felt a strange sense of normalcy, something money and power had long since stripped from his life. They ate in silence at the small table on the balcony, the sea breeze for company. Marina ate with a ravenous appetite, but with a delicacy that hinted at careful instruction, likely Helena's teachings. "Helena taught me not to talk with my mouth full," she said suddenly, as if reading his thoughts. Arthur smiled, a genuine smile that surprised even himself. "She used to tell me the same thing." The mention of her name created a bridge between them, a safe territory where they could meet. Marina began to talk, little by little, about Helena's visits to the orphanage. She told him about the secret picnics they had in the garden, the books they read together, the promises of a future that never came. Arthur listened, absorbing every word, every detail. They were pieces of a puzzle he never knew existed, and with each piece that clicked into place, the image of his wife became fuller, more complex, and infinitely more beautiful. He learned that Helena had secretly sponsored the education of several children, made anonymous donations to shelters, and that her charity work went far beyond the galas and public events he was aware of. She had a whole life of altruism, a cash flow of kindness that never appeared on any financial statement. The conversation was interrupted by the ringing of Arthur's cell phone. It was Albert, his driver, his voice fraught with worry. "Sir, is everything all right? The police were at the mansion, and some people from an orphanage. They're saying you kidnapped a child." The word kidnapped landed like a stone in Arthur's stomach. Reality hit him hard. He wasn't a hero on a rescue mission. In the eyes of the law, he was a criminal. His reputation, which Helena had feared Marina might tarnish, was now at risk because of his own impulsive actions. He had acted from the heart, but the world he lived in was governed by laws and procedures. Mrs. Albright and the social worker didn't see a man protecting a child. They saw a powerful stranger absconding with a minor who was a ward of the state. The situation was far more serious than he had imagined. He looked at Marina, who was watching him with wide eyes, having overheard the key word. The fear was back. He needed a lawyer, the best his money could buy. But more than that, he realized the real battle wouldn't just be in the courts. It would be proving to a skeptical system, and to himself, that he was worthy of caring for the most precious treasure Helena had left him. The word kidnapped echoed in the quiet apartment, poisoning the salt air and the peace they had found. Arthur ended the call, his face a granite mask. He looked at Marina, who was watching him with eyes full of that familiar terror he was fighting so hard to erase. In an instant, the safe refuge had become a gilded cage. The outside world, with its laws and judgments, was banging at the door. He knelt in front of her, taking her small hands in his. "Listen, Marina," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "They're wrong. We haven't done anything wrong. You are not a runaway, and I am not a kidnapper. We are a family figuring out how to start. And I promise you, with everything I am, that I will not let anyone take you away from me." The words came out with a conviction he didn't know he possessed. It wasn't a business strategy. It was an oath. The fear in Marina's eyes didn't vanish completely, but it was tempered by a glimmer of hope. She believed him. That trust was the most valuable capital he had ever held. He stood up, his mind already working, plotting strategies. He picked up the phone again and dialed the number for Marcus. His lead counsel, a brilliant, ruthless man who had helped him build and protect his empire for over 20 years. "Marcus," Arthur said, dispensing with pleasantries. "Forget the merger, cancel the meeting on the hedge funds. I have a personal problem, the most important one of my life." He summarized the situation with surgical precision, omitting the emotional details, focusing on the facts. "They're accusing me of kidnapping. I want you to mobilize everything. Hire the best family law specialists, use all of our resources. I don't care what it costs." There was a pause on the other end of the line before Marcus replied, his voice cautious. "Arthur, this is delicate. You're a high-profile individual. The press will devour this. A widowed billionaire runs off with an orphan. The optics are bad. They'll argue that grief has affected your judgment, that you're unstable." Marcus's cold analysis was a dose of reality. His own reputation, his image as a powerful, controlled man, was now a weapon to be used against him. His strength had become his greatest weakness. Hanging up, Arthur felt a surge of frustration. He walked to the window, staring at the waves breaking ceaselessly on the shore, so predictable, so constant, unlike his life, which had descended into chaos. Marina came and stood beside him, silent. "Helena kept everything in boxes," she said softly, as if offering a secret. "She had a special box, a treasure box. She showed it to me once. She said it held the most important things in the world to her." A spark of hope ignited in Arthur's chest. What if Helena had left something behind? An explanation, a letter, anything that could prove he wasn't crazy, that her connection to Marina was real and profound. "Where is this box, Marina? Do you know?" She thought for a moment, then pointed to a large wooden wardrobe in the corner of the room. "I think I saw her put it in there once." Together, they opened the wardrobe doors, behind stacks of lavender-scented sheets and towels. There it was, a plain, dark wood box, unadorned but for a small brass clasp. Arthur's heart raced. This was it. He could feel it. With trembling hands, he lifted it out and placed it on the table. It was locked, just as he was looking for something to pry the lock. His phone rang again. It was Marcus. "Arthur, bad news," the lawyer said, his voice urgent. The director of the orphanage and the social worker went straight to a judge. "They've been granted an emergency custody order. You have 24 hours to turn Marina over to the authorities, or they will issue a warrant for your arrest." The lawyer's ultimatum hung in the air, more threatening than the storm that was beginning to brew over the ocean. 24 hours. $200 million in his bank account, a network of contacts that spanned the globe, an army of lawyers at his command, and it all came down to a ticking clock. The system, the impersonal machine of the law that he had so often used to his advantage in business disputes, was now turned against him with crushing force. He could feel the walls closing in. He looked at Marina, who was watching him, her small hand instinctively reaching for his. In that touch, he found his resolve. He would not turn her over. Fighting the system was one thing, surrendering was another. "Marcus, find a loophole, a continuance, anything. Buy me time," Arthur said into the phone, his voice low and dangerous. "And find a locksmith, the best in the city. Send him to this address, now." He ended the call before the lawyer could protest. His focus returned to the wooden box on the table. That simple object now held the entire weight of their future. It was his only hope, his only defense against a world that saw him as a villain. While they waited, a tense silence filled the small apartment. The storm outside grew, the wind howling and rain lashing against the windows, mirroring the turmoil in their hearts. To distract Marina and himself, Arthur began telling her stories about Helena, stories he hadn't shared with anyone in a very long time. He told her about their first meeting, how she'd tripped and spilled coffee all over his expensive shirt, and instead of apologizing, she'd laughed, a sound so infectious he fell in love on the spot. He told her about their travels, the nights they danced in the living room, the way she could find beauty in the simplest things. Marina listened, eyes shining, hanging on his every word, and she shared her own stories too. Small vignettes from Helena's visits to the orphanage that filled in the gaps of a life Arthur never knew. In that exchange of memories, they were no longer a millionaire and an orphan. They were two people joined by grief, building a bridge over the abyss of loss with the fragments of Helena's love. The locksmith arrived a few hours later, a small, efficient man who picked the old lock in under a minute, oblivious to the drama surrounding him. As soon as he was gone, Arthur and Marina huddled over the box. The lid creaked open. The scent of old paper and lavender perfume, Helena's scent, drifted out. Inside, carefully arranged, were her treasures. There were no jewels, no gold, no stock certificates. There were seashells, the first flower Arthur had ever given her, pressed between the pages of a book, ticket stubs from their first date, and underneath it all, a bundle of envelopes tied with a blue satin ribbon. Helena's elegant, familiar script adorned each one. The first envelope said simply, "For Arthur." With his heart pounding in his throat, he opened it. The letter began, "My dearest Arthur, if you are reading this, it means you have found our Marina." Every word was both a balm and a knife. She explained everything, the desire for motherhood she had suppressed for years, believing it would disrupt his life. The day she met Marina, an abandoned newborn, during a volunteer visit to the orphanage, the instant, overwhelming love, the fear of telling him, not because he was a bad man, but because she loved him too much to risk overburdening him, to risk shattering the perfectly constructed world they shared. The secret visits, the plans to one day tell him everything, the illness that came too fast. Tears streamed down Arthur's face as he read. They were tears of sorrow, but also of a deep, liberating understanding. He hadn't been shut out, he had been protected in a misguided but loving way. At the bottom of the box, there was more. A larger envelope contained documents, a revised will never filed, leaving a substantial trust fund for Marina's education and welfare, and most importantly, a formal adoption application filled out and signed by Helena, dated just a few months before she passed. She had been preparing to fight for Marina, to bring her home. She just ran out of time. At that exact moment, loud, authoritative knocks sounded at the door. "Arthur Sterling, this is the police. We know you're in there. Open the door." Arthur looked at the papers in his hand, the proof of Helena's love and intent. He looked at Marina, her face pale with terror. The battle wasn't over, it was just beginning. The knocking at the door was like a hammer against Arthur's heart. The ultimatum had expired. The police, the law, the entire system was outside, ready to tear them apart. For an instant, the old fighting instinct took over. He could barricade himself in, use his influence to create a standoff, turn this into a media circus. But then he looked at Marina. The terror in her eyes wasn't because of the police. It was the fear of being taken back, of losing the only family connection she had left. He realized then that the true victory wouldn't be won with confrontation, but with truth. The truth he now held in his trembling hands. With a calm that surprised even himself, he stood, Helena's documents held firmly. He knelt in front of Marina. "Don't be afraid," he said, his voice steady. "I'm not going anywhere, and neither are you. Trust me." He gave her a kiss on the forehead, a paternal gesture that felt like the most natural thing in the world, and walked to the door. When he opened it, he was met by two uniformed police officers and, behind them, the severe figure of Mrs. Albright and a social worker with an impassive face. The orphanage director shot him a triumphant glare. "It's over, Mr. Sterling. You can't buy your way out of everything." Arthur ignored her. His focus was on the senior officer, a man with tired but fair eyes. "Officers, there has been a terrible misunderstanding," he began, his voice calm and controlled, the same one he used to soothe panicked investors. "No, I haven't kidnapped anyone. I was protecting my late wife's daughter." He held out the papers to the officer. "Please, read these." The officer took the documents hesitantly, exchanging a look with his partner. Mrs. Albright snorted. "How absurd! Forged papers! He's a desperate man!" But as the officer read Helena's letter, his expression shifted. The sternness gave way to confusion, then to a flicker of understanding. He scanned the adoption application, the unmistakable signature, the date. He looked over Arthur's shoulder and saw Marina huddled in the living room, clutching the wooden box like a life raft. The scene was not one of a kidnapping. It was one of a family grieving. This changes things, the officer said slowly, handing the documents to the social worker, whose face also softened as she read Helena's words. This proves nothing, Mrs. Albright insisted, but her voice had lost its conviction. At that moment, Marcus, the lawyer, arrived, hurrying up the stairs. "Sorry I'm late. Traffic was hell." He took charge, his imposing presence and precise legal language turning the apartment hallway into a makeshift courtroom. He presented the documents as evidence of Helena's clear intent. He argued that Arthur's actions, while unconventional, were motivated by the protection of the child, as per his late wife's expressed wishes. He announced he would be filing an immediate petition for temporary custody of Marina on Arthur's behalf, using Helena's documents as the foundation. The battle that followed was fought not with shouting, but with motions and affidavits. It lasted for days, which turned into weeks. Arthur and Marina remained in the seaside apartment in a kind of legal limbo. But it wasn't a time of passive waiting, it was a time of building. Arthur taught Marina how to play chess. Marina taught him how to build sandcastles. They cooked together, read Helena's books together, and night after night he read her the letters from the box, revealing the depth of the love her mother had for her. With each passing day, the bond between them strengthened, forged not by blood, but by shared loss and a newly discovered love. The final hearing was tense. Mrs. Albright painted Arthur as an unstable eccentric, a billionaire using his wealth to indulge a whim. But Marcus was brilliant. He not only presented Helena's documents, but also brought in witnesses. The groundskeeper from the cemetery who spoke of Marina's devotion to the tomb, and, to everyone's surprise, Albert the driver, who testified with tears in his eyes about the transformation he had seen in his employer from a closed-off, grieving man to someone with a purpose. The judge, a wise and experienced woman, heard it all. And then she asked to speak with Marina. Alone, when Marina emerged from the chambers minutes later, she ran into Arthur's arms. He held her tight, his heart in his throat. The judge returned, her face serious. She looked at Arthur, then at Mrs. Albright, considering the evidence presented, especially the documented wishes of the late Mrs. Sterling, and most importantly, the testimony and well-being of the child. "I am granting temporary custody of Marina to Mr. Arthur Sterling." The victory wasn't a thunderclap, but a collective sigh of relief. It was done. They could go home together. The drive back to the mansion was completely different from that grey Sunday afternoon 5 weeks earlier. The luxury sedan no longer felt like an empty shell, but a vessel carrying a future. Beside Arthur, Marina looked out the window with curious, no longer frightened, eyes. She held Helena's wooden box on her lap, her treasure and her inheritance. When Albert pulled up to the imposing entrance, the house no longer looked like a mausoleum of sad memories. With Marina's small hand in his, Arthur felt that he was, for the very first time, truly coming home. The first few days were an adjustment. The house, once silent and cavernous, now echoed with the sound of laughter and scampering feet. Marina explored every corner with the wonder of someone discovering a new world. She turned one of the opulent guest suites into her own sanctuary, decorating it not with the expensive toys Arthur insisted on buying, but with the seashells and stones from Helena's refuge. Arthur, in turn, found a new routine. Mornings no longer began with stock market reports, but with the smell of pancakes he was learning to make from a cookbook. Afternoons were no longer filled with board meetings, but with homework and walks in the garden. He transformed his home office, once the nerve center of his financial empire, into a space for them. Stock tickers were replaced by Marina's colorful drawings. The phones that connected him to New York and Hong Kong were now used to schedule dentist appointments and piano lessons. He discovered that the return on one of Marina's smiles was infinitely higher than the dividends from any of his stocks. The fortune he had spent a lifetime accumulating had finally found its true purpose, not as an end in itself, but as a tool to build a safe and happy home for the girl Helena had entrusted to him. One evening, sitting in the library, Arthur took the last envelope from the wooden box. It was a letter Helena had written to Marina. His voice thick with emotion, he began to read. "My little sea star," the letter began. "If you are reading this with Arthur, it means that love found a way, as it always does. Know that I never wanted to leave you. My greatest dream was to see the two of you together, my family. Take care of him for me, because beneath all that businessman armor is the kindest heart I have ever known. And Arthur, my love, take care of her. She is the best of me, the best of us." Tears flowed freely down Arthur's face, but they were not tears of grief. They were tears of gratitude. He looked at Marina, who was also crying softly, and pulled her into a hug. In that embrace, he finally felt whole. He hadn't lost Helena. He had found her in a new way, through the eyes of the daughter she had given him. He understood that his wife's legacy wasn't in the assets she left behind, but in the love she had planted. A love strong enough to outlive death and bloom in the most unexpected of places. The girl who slept on a cold headstone had awakened a man who had buried himself in his own sorrow. The billionaire businessman who feared vulnerability discovered that true wealth lay not in his assets, but in the capacity to love and be loved. And the cemetery, once a place of final goodbyes, had become the birthplace of a new family. A bittersweet reminder that sometimes it is in our greatest loss that we find our most precious gain. Arthur looked at the photograph of Helena on the mantelpiece, the same one from the tomb, and smiled. "We made it, my love," he whispered. "We're home,